Hi, everybody. Welcome to Statistics Solutions, the Chapter 5 webinar. Sierra is posting some links here in the chat box for our website, where we have all kinds of dissertation resources. We also archive the webinars, this webinar and other webinars there, so you can find those. I believe you'll also be getting a copy of this webinar. Okay, let me real quick before we get started, I just want to give a few words about who we are. This is our number, this is our contact information, full services dissertation consulting company. Everything from statistics help to help with various any of the chapters. Other things too, like PowerPoint defenses, IRB assistance. So it's worth, if you're interested, to check our website to see what we offer, and just to check out our resources, and to, if you're interested, make an appointment to talk to somebody about what we offer and if that's right for you. Okay, so to Chapter 5. If you were on Chapter 5, congratulations, that's quite an accomplishment, getting to this point. If you're just kind of sitting in, you're not quite there yet, you're just kind of seeing what's going on in Chapter 5, getting ahead of the game, that's of course fine too. But if you're at the Chapter 5, again, congratulations. Sometimes people like to go, phew, I can see the finish line, which is great. But there's still work to do, right? The Chapter 5 is not typically as maybe time consuming as some of the other chapters, but it's important because it's kind of the culmination of your study. It's what you found. It's your discussion of the findings, right? Chapter 4 presents your findings. Chapter 5 is your interpretations, your discussions, what they mean in relation to other research, what you're recommending based on what you found. So it's an important chapter. So I always like to tell people, don't quite rest on your laurels yet. It's not over. You're very close, and you should be heartened. You should be excited about that. But what I'm saying is resist the temptation to rush through the Chapter 5. Again, it's important. It's like I said, it's where you're discussing your finding. It's maybe, all the sections are important, but this is where you here's what you found, here's what it means, here's what we can do with this information, here's what I recommend that we do with this information. So it's important. So kind of take your time with it, and do a good job, I guess is what I'm trying to get out. Okay. All right, so here are what we're going to be covering. Discussion chapters, even though some of the headings may be a little different among schools, or the organization of the headers may be a little different. The discussion chapters, they typically contain similar features even across schools, because it is a place where you're going to talk about what you found and interpret it and talk about it in relation to previous research, and make recommendations for further research based on that, sometimes recommendations for practice. So these content are pretty standard. Again, though, check your own school's template just for what they are requiring. Again, sometimes the headers may be worded a little differently, or they may have a different organization. Some schools even split the discussion chapter with the interpretation of the findings in one chapter, and then another chapter for recommendations, which is, again, it's the same kind of information, it's just split. So this is a good general guide, but again, always follow the specifics of your template. Okay. So the introduction. Typically, the introduction, the Chapter 5 is usually somewhat a standalone chapter. Like, you can read it and kind of get what was done in the study and why, and then you get to discussing your results. So the introduction really should kind of reorient the reader. So it's always helpful to restate the purpose of your study. And when you restate the purpose of your study, anytime you restate the purpose, you should restate it verbatim. It's like the research questions. Once the research questions are set, once the purpose is set, it doesn't change. So those things should always be restated verbatim, the purpose statement and the research questions. Now, you don't get a pass on anything else. Like, you can't kind of pull a section from chapter 2 and throw it in chapter 5. Professors frown on that, and you shouldn't anyway. But in these two cases, a purpose statement, the research questions, they always stay the same. So restate your purpose. Remind the reader of why you conducted your study, right? So this is going to sound a lot like the research problem. Why was it important or necessary to conduct your study? Why was it needed? Okay, so remind the reader about that. Sometimes, again, check your template. Sometimes they'll want a little bit of a summary about your methods, the methods that you use. And again, it's a summary and it's just a reminder for the reader, so you don't need to go into depth about it. And then if you want, at the end of the introduction, you can preview contents of the chapter, right? The sections that are going to be coming in the chapter. All right, interpretation of the findings. This is usually kind of the meat of the chapter. This is where you talk about what the implications you're finding, what they mean. And usually it's not interpretation just like your own subjective interpretation. It is an interpretation that's derived from relating what you found to previous research, right? So the way to handle this section is usually to section it out with subsections, because that's going to make it easier for you as a writer. So it's writer friendly. It's also going to make it easier for your readers. It's going to be reader friendly, right? So rather than having one lump of information for all your research questions or all your themes or all your findings, which is going to get confusing, section it out. If the study is quantitative, usually section it out by your research questions or hypotheses, right? For that research question. If it's qualitative, you can usually section it out by your themes, all right? Qualitative research, the findings usually take the form of themes. So for each of these subsections, right? So restate or summarize the finding or the theme. So if it's quantitative research question 1, here's what research question 1 asked. Just summarize very concisely what you found for that research question. If it's qualitative, restate your theme 1, okay? And then give a little kind of summary of the theme. And then what you want to do is discuss what you found in relation to previous literature. And the previous literature is going to be found in chapter 2. And the idea here is part of what you want to do is to note whether your research supports previous research or doesn't support previous research. Now, sometimes previous research is mixed, right? So if that's the case, you're going to have to, be kind of discriminate between, what your findings support and what they don't find, or what they support and what they don't support, sorry. So situate your findings in relation to the previous research, noting if they support or don't support, or even if they reveal something new that's novel. That's important too, okay? Okay, all right. Then you can make conclusions based on those discussions, right? If your findings support previous research, well, then whatever it was that you looked at, you can make a conclusion about that, right? If your findings don't support previous research, that suggests that things are still kind of inconclusive, which may indicate that more research is needed in the area. Sometimes people get kind of crestfallen that their findings don't support previous research, or their findings are not significant. And it's all good. I mean, it's your findings. It's what you get. You're a researcher. You're approaching things objectively. So findings that are non-significant, they still tell us things, right? Findings that don't support previous research, they tell us things too, right? So that it's not bad that your findings don't support or they're not significant. It's just what you got. It's just what they are. And you have to find out what that says, right? If it doesn't support previous research, well, it says something else. That could be based on maybe your population. There may be some explanation that you're going to have to think of why your findings don't support previous research, because that's typical. If your findings don't support previous research, it's kind of typical that you give a kind of an explanation for why that might be. And again, it could be from various things. It could have to do with your population was different, something about your study was different, or there may be some explanation that you can pull in from the literature. So that's the idea in this section. And so you do that for research question 1 or theme 1, then you do it for the next research question or the next theme, and you just repeat until you're done. So that's the idea in the interpretation of the finding section. The next section is sometimes it's woven into the discussion section, or sometimes it's a standalone section on its own called limitations. It's expected that you're going to discuss what were limitations about your study, right? To just be transparent about things that may have affected your results. So explain any shortcoming, any weakness. In this section 2, it's customary to discuss whether your findings will generalize to the larger study population. So limitations, a big limitation, for example, for quantitative research is a low sample, right? If you have a small sample, low sample size, because that interferes, or that compromises statistical certainty. So that's definitely something you would put in there for your limitations. In a good place to look in your study, in chapter 1 or chapter 3, or maybe both, there should be a section on limitations. And at that point, it was you looking ahead to see what may be limitations going forward in your study. And now that you've conducted your study, you can go back to those sections and see if any of the things that you said actually turned out to be limitations. That will give you a place to look too. For qualitative studies, researcher bias is always kind of a potential limitation. Some people are, maybe too close to the subject. And so there's strategies to kind of help you remain objective. And, if you think, that was the case, you can put that in as your limitation and talk about some of the ways, the strategies that you use to kind of help mitigate that researcher bias. Sometimes social desirability bias is a limitation. Social desirability bias, right? That means that, especially in studies with touchy subjects, maybe sexuality, maybe body issues, weight, things that are a little kind of touchy, I would just say, sensitive. Sometimes people will want to answer in ways that put them in a positive light rather than truthfully. That's called social desirability bias. So you can look that up, and if you think you have one of those studies that where people may have answered that way, you can include that. So those are just a couple things, but anything that has a potential to affect your results. Generalizability, of course, is how well your findings are going to apply to the larger study population. For quantitative studies, there's a couple of things that help with the generalizability. If your sample size is adequate, or it's even larger than it's supposed to be, that helps generalizability. Also, your recruiting, like if you do random sampling, or your sampling strategy, if you do random sampling, that helps increase the generalizability. For qualitative studies, that usually qualitative studies involve interviews, right? And if you're doing interviews, your sample is low by design. You can't interview 100 people, right? Like quantitative studies survey, that many people or more. You're going to interview about 8 or 10, right? Interviews are time and labor intensive. And also, you probably don't need to. You reach something called saturation, where you start getting the same answers. So by design, the samples are low, 10 people you interviewed. So generalizability is not a goal for qualitative studies, but it's worth mentioning that the sample is low by design, but that qualitative studies are not meant to the findings are not meant to generalize. What they're meant to do is give you in-depth information, in-depth data on topics that quantitative studies with larger sample sizes cannot do. All right. Implications for practice. This means, and it's like it sounds, what do your findings mean for people at the level of practice? If it's an education study, you conducted an education study. You're going to look at why special education teachers, or you looked at why special education teachers leave the profession. So think about the value of your findings to people at the level of practice and education. Who would those people be? Teachers themselves, yes, but probably administrators, right? That would have value to administrators, why these, folks under their, who they're working with and who are working under them are leaving. So they could then implement and adopt strategies to, help retain them. So this is about discussing the value of your findings to people at the level of practice, whatever that is. And you can be specific here, if it means, hey, we need to run, we need to run workshops to help support these teachers, or we need, to get them involved in more professional development. We need to set money aside for the professional development, or whatever it is. So you can get kind of nuts and bolts and specific here. Yeah, and basically, what does it mean for professionals in your field? How does it help them do what they do? Okay, and then it's usually a section, recommendations for further research. So, and it's just like it sounds, it's based on what you found, and it can be based on limitations too, to some degree. And we'll go over each of those. Based on what you found, what do you suggest that researchers moving forward look at? And you've seen this probably in articles that you've read for your study. At the end, after the discussion, right near the very end, they usually have recommendations for further research, and that's what you're going to be doing in yours. So findings that don't support, here's some examples or some ideas here. Findings that don't support previous research, like if your findings didn't support the previous research, you could suggest more research on that, because that suggests that there's still inconclusiveness, right? That the issue really isn't settled. Anything novel or new or unexpected definitely deserves further research, or recommending further research on it. You can also recommend different types of studies to get different types of information, or to get different information. So if you did the education study on why special education teachers leave the field, and you did interviews with special education teachers. If you wanted to recommend that researchers get a more holistic vision, more comprehensive view of the phenomenon, you could recommend case studies, right? Where you take a school, and it might involve interviews, but it might also involve like classroom observations. It might also involve looking at documents, educational documents. So a case study has multiple sources of data, right? So you get a more comprehensive view of the topic. So again, you could recommend different types of research to get different types of information. But if you do that, always say why you're recommending. Don't just say, hey, I recommend a case study, and then just leave it at that. Say why you're recommending a case study. Okay, sometimes the recommendations can be based on limitations too. So the idea here is if you had a limitation in your study, you would recommend that researchers replicate the study or conduct a similar study, but they just take pains to address what were limitations in your study. Okay, in the summary, this is optional. Check your school checklist. Some schools let you end after recommendations for future research. Some schools want a summary or a conclusion. If you need to put a summary or conclusion on there, just remember it's not only the summary for the chapter, it's the end of the study. So you want to recap major points from the chapter, like in any other summary of any other chapter, but you also want to leave the reader with the most important things you want them to remember about your study, the most important findings, right? You want to sell that. That's what I always tell people, and sell your findings at the end. You may not think what you found is all that important, but to the research, it can be. It can be valuable research, even though sometimes it doesn't appear to us like, oh, finding out the reasons people leave special education, that can't be that important. Well, it is to them. It is to administrators. So sell your findings. Hit that message hard, right? The most important things about your finding you want readers to remember. That's what you want to leave them with, right? The take-home message. And we're back to who we are. This is our contact information. The chapter 5, it's not that long. Sweet spot, I would say, is about 10 to 15 pages, 10, 12, seems good. Quantitative studies sometimes are a little shorter than qual studies, which, maybe 15 pages. The idea here is if you're done with your chapter 5 in 5 or 6 pages, you probably don't have enough there. If you're going on for 30 pages, you probably have too much. So it's just to kind of give you a ballpark reference. So any questions? I'm happy to try to answer any questions that you have. You can just type them in the question and answer box or the chat box. I'll give you a couple minutes. And always a good, if you haven't already done this, and I'm sure a lot of you have, always get an example from your school, from your chair or from the library, but from your school, similar, just so you have an example of a dissertation. I mean, the template is good. The template tells you, what goes in it and what the sections are and describes what goes into each section. But sometimes it's just, there's nothing more helpful than having an example to see how people handle some of these sections. So that's always good. Can you share the PowerPoint? Yeah, I think you'll be getting copies of them. You'll be getting copies of the PowerPoint, and they are archived on our website. If you look in the webinar chat box, this one is archived there as well as others. Is it necessary to write the subheadings, or can you just write as paragraphs in chapter 5? Well, if your school, I mean, check your template. If your template wants, certain headings like this, you're going to have to include the headings. As far as the subheadings that I was mentioning in the interpretation section, you don't need to, but you just want to make sure that your material is organized and well structured, so when then people read it, they can follow things clearly. So not necessary for those subheaders, but it tends to make things a little more organized. So that's up to you. Is chapter 5 affected by the type of qualitative study chosen? Not a lot. Let's say you did focus groups instead of interviews. I mean, you're still going to have themes, or you're still going to have findings from those focus groups. And you're still going to have to talk about it in relation to previous research. So not really. I mean, you're going to, your findings may come out of focus groups. They may not be themes. I don't know exactly. Sometimes focus groups are a little different. But your data may come into, it may not be themes, it may be called something else, but the idea is the same, that you discuss what you found in relation to previous research. So there may be slightly different, but overall the idea is still the same, that you discuss your findings in relation to previous literature, make recommendations based on that. Okay, did that help? Anybody else have questions? Okay, here's one. I'm doing a quant study using multiple linear regression. The analysis showed no relationships between the variables and no normal distribution even after multiple passes of removing outliers. So I'm really struggling with what to write about in chapter 5. Okay, so there was no significant relationships. You write about that similarly. If it was not significant, you still relate that to previous literature, right? And you still say that that your findings supported or did not support. And then you still base conclusions on that. If your findings support that there's no significance, then you can make a conclusion that there's no significance between these two variables. If your findings don't support, like say the research says, yes, there's significance between these two variables, and you found that there wasn't, yours just doesn't support that previous research. And so you're going to have to think about some reasons why that might be so. And you're going to have to conclude that research is kind of inconclusive here because your findings didn't support. So you still have things to write about, and you can still relate it to the previous literature. So that's what I was saying. I mean, it still tells us things. It's just maybe not what you were expecting, or maybe not what you were hoping to find. Let's see. I am also reaching no significance on my analysis that is inconsistent with the literature. Right. So same thing. You're just going to have to say that it is not consistent with the literature, that it doesn't support the literature, which is fine. There's nobody that said, nowhere that it says that the quality of your study is based on the significance of your findings. If you didn't find any significance, that's what you found. So you're going to just have to say that. You're just going to have to say that it doesn't support the previous literature, and you're going to have to think about some reasons or a reason why that might be so. It could come from the literature. It might have something to do with the way you conducted your study, or your population was different than populations of previous research. But think about how you could explain that difference. But again, I don't want people to feel kind of like, oh, my study was terrible because I didn't find significance. It doesn't mean that at all. Okay. Let's see. Where's the let's see, it is a must that all the findings in chapter 5 appear, okay, let me see. Is it a must that all the findings in chapter 5 appear in chapter 2 also, or can you discuss something not in chapter 2? Okay, so you mean that you mean the sources, like the research that you connect your findings to, does it need to appear in chapter 2? Most of it should come from chapter 2. Can you bring in new stuff? Is that what you're asking? Can you bring in stuff that's not in chapter 2 and chapter 5? Yes, you can. There's nothing to say that you can't. I think that's fine. And sometimes professors want you to do kind of a little mini lit review, not a lit review, but a little mini lit search to see if anything has come out recently while you've been conducting your study. Usually nothing has come out, but sometimes, you know, it happens. So yes, you can bring in new stuff. I wouldn't bring in a lot, but you can. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, the raised hand. Where? How do I get to the raised hand? Okay, we got any other questions? Yeah, did I get your question? Okay. All right, no more questions. All right, well, I wish everybody luck. And of course, if you want to, you know, make an appointment to talk to somebody or just go to our website and look at our resources that we have, feel free. And have a great day, everybody. Thank you.